There we go. The meeting is now being recorded. So the link and a survey will be sent out later this week after the completion of today's session. All of the participants are in listen mode only, and questions can be typed in using the chat feature in the bottom right hand of your screen. I will keep track of those questions as we go on, and we'll pose them to Kevin at the end of his presentation. Because this presentation is so short, we've left the information about our speakers and the program developers to just be slides. And so you can see right now the slide up, it talks about our subject matter experts and Kevin, our presenter, as well. Kevin, can you advance to the next slide?
Yes, I can.
And this slide just tells you a little bit about both of the co-sponsoring organizations. Our websites are there, so if you need additional information or wish to contact us at some point after today, you can follow those links and we'll find information to do that. Okay, so without further ado, Kevin, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Well, first of all, I want to, on behalf of the Center and the ACICR, thank you for participating in this webinar. We're very excited to be able to do this. Look, the list of names that you saw involved in putting this together is certainly longer than just myself, and I'm fortunate to have been able to work with that group. I thought that that meant I was the best looking one of the bunch. That's why they were putting me on the webinar. Then I found out there's no cameras, so that tells me how good looking I really am. But we are certainly very excited to be doing this for teachers. Certainly we have always had strong interest from educators and frontline workers around the area of suicide and suicidal ideation, particularly for children and adolescents. And the ability to do a webinar such as this, granted it's a short period of time that we have to work with, it's great for us to be able to bring this training to the educators, the people who are working frontline with the kids in the community. And as a parent of a 13 and 9-year-old, I know how much time teachers spend with my kids as well. So the ability to engage you in a discussion about suicide related to the kids that are in your school as a way of increasing your confidence and ultimately your confidence in working with these young people is something that we are very proud to be a part of. Recognizing that we have a limited amount of time, I will move as efficiently through the slides as I can, probably absent of any fancy transitions or things of that nature. And please, if you have questions as we go along, feel free to type them in. As we always say here at the center, we are responsive to questions, and we know if one person has a question, it means other people do as well, and we want to make sure that we do the best that we can to answer questions people may have. So in putting this together, we identified sort of 5 of the biggest themes or the most prevalent themes when we looked at the issue of teen suicide that we thought teachers might benefit from information about. And the first one is this notion of attention seeking. For so many of us, teachers, you're working frontline in that most emergent role with young people who are potentially having a bad day or who are having a real tough time in their journey and in their story. But many of others have worked in frontline roles before, and we know that term attention seeking gets thrown around as a negative connotation. And from the perspective of suicide, we want to encourage people to look at the notion of attention seeking and turn that on its ear and look at it as they are seeking attention. And oftentimes children and youth who are struggling with issues, whether it's related to suicide, whether it's terrible things that are going on at home, whether it's challenges they're facing at school, they simply lack the experience, the life experience and the emotional maturity to be able to say, hey, I need to talk to you, something is going wrong in my life. So what we see are these odd behaviors, what we see are these things that can be frustrating to us as adults, and the ways that they seek to draw us into those discussions sometimes have the risk of pushing us away. And I think if we can begin by looking at this and in a way in our mind thinking, thank God this kid found a way to reach out and tell me something is wrong, then some of those weird behaviors we can spin in a positive cycle and say, this is this kid's only way of telling me that something is wrong. The youngest reported suicide that I'm familiar with in Canada is 6 years of age. So to suggest a 6-year-old may be able to come to you and say, things are so bad, I'm thinking about suicide, is an unrealistic expectation for a caregiver to have. The behaviors you may see in your settings, academic difficulties, certainly a number of kids have various struggles depending on some of their cognitive and physical backgrounds. I have a son who's on an IPP due to a medical issue, and what we see is that plays out in academic difficulties. So academic difficulties alone are not an indicator of suicide, but coupled with other things that might tell you something isn't wrong or isn't going right. Children and youth who are struggling with their sexual identity or trying to find their way. We know the GLBT community. We see higher risk and rates of suicide in that community compared to the non-GLBT community, and would certainly, we want to give deference to what a struggle that would be for a young person in your school, trying to figure out who they are. And of course, the biggest fear in life is being different than your peers. For those of you who are in my age group, think back to your own adolescence and junior high. If you weren't that kid wearing a Roots sweatshirt, you stood out like a sore thumb. And as an oversimplified example, we know that young people don't like to stand out, and that's probably the most simple way for them to be different. Relationship or romantic difficulties. As the parent of a 13-year-old, I don't like thinking about the notion of romantic difficulties for my 13-year-old, but we know that relationships, and at times romantic relationships, are significant in the child's life and in a young person's life, particularly those who might be vulnerable or might be isolated or more alone at home. And we know that relationships are fickle, they're ever-changing, and we know that when a relationship ends, it can be the most traumatic thing in that young person's life until they come to school the next day and have a new boyfriend again. So when we see that a young person is struggling with relationships, is struggling to engage and maintain relationships that we've historically seen to be important to them, that's an indicator, that's a way that they tell us that things have changed for them. Obviously, severe anger, and where you're going to see this is sometimes you may have students who are simply work from a place of anger, work from a place of frustration. It's going to be more of a change in that behavior. It's going to tell you that that kid who normally was able to manage their emotions all of a sudden is a basket case, all of a sudden is lashing out all over the place. Something is going wrong for that person. And finally, history of suicidal ideation or thoughts of suicide. We know that there are children who think about suicide. We know that if they're not supported or treated, that doesn't go away. So you may be looking at a 12, 13, 14-year-old kid who's had thoughts of suicide previous to today if you're having a conversation with them. So if you know that a young person has had historic struggles with thoughts of suicide, and then you're seeing some of these odd behaviors, it might be an indicator to you that this child may be suffering again from those thoughts of suicide. And again, it's unrealistic for us to ask them to be able to come to us and say, things are so bad, I need your help with suicide. Moving on to the second fact, we do know that people at risk of suicide will communicate invitations to us to help. They'll ask for ways that aren't tangible. They'll let us know things aren't right. And we know this because the vast majority of suicidal individuals find ways to seek support or find ways to stay alive. So obviously, if they are threatening suicide, that's a fairly tangible way that we know something isn't right for the student in front of you. And again, that can be something that can be lumped in as an attention-seeking behavior. Anybody in this webinar has ever worked in a group home or in a treatment facility, you know that that's one of the most common threats or common ways to draw people in. Previous attempts, obviously, again, if we know that somebody's had attempts in the past, and we start to see some synergy in the stories of what they're experiencing in their life or in some of their behaviors, we may know that they go back to that as well. What you're going to see as educators most likely is going to be changes in behavior. The kids who are struggling with suicide or some other things, we start to see changes in behavior, and usually these are changes in behavior that are going to get you talking to your colleagues in the hallways, in the staff room, or after school on the way out to the car when you say, oh my God, have you seen little Johnny lately? Can you believe what he's doing? These kinds of changes in behavior are marked, they're noticeable, and they get you talking, or they get your gut churning, and they get you thinking, I need to talk to so-and-so about this and see if they've seen it before as well. Changes in behavior might appear as high-risk-taking behaviors as well. Certainly in your school, you will have kids who are willing to engage in high-risk behaviors, and it just seems to be part of their personality or whatever that may be. But what we're more looking at is the kids who are typically a little bit more cautious or reserved, when we all of a sudden start to see high risk associated with their behavior that tells us that they're struggling. Giving away possessions is a behavior that's often most associated with young people, children, and specifically adolescents, not so much with adults. You see a young person giving away items, particularly those that might be of value to them, those that might be important, and especially if you're working with young people who may be bouncing around from home to home or may be involved in the child welfare system, and they literally have very few things that they can call their own and place value and possession on. When we start to see distribution of those things that may be important to them, it's not necessarily a sign that they're a good sharer. Shouldn't be confused with the kids who are just generally generous people and will help anybody in their time of need. But again, when you see somebody giving away something that you know is important to them, that can be an indicator that that young person is thinking about suicide. And finally, when we talk about absenteeism, this is not just the notion of not coming to school regularly, but this is that notion of being absent or withdrawing from the things that are important to them, the things, the relationships, the activities. This is the kid who was, fairly sociable in the hallway, and now you're noticing they're sitting in the library by themselves in the corner all the time. They take their lunch and sit out on the hill in the middle of winter so that they're not with anybody, or they may stop coming to school regularly. They're changing their relationships with the teachers and the staff in the school, those sorts of things where you see them pulling away from the things and the people, the activities that have historically provided joy and comfort and safety to them, and you noticeably see a change in that. Withdrawal is a behavior that we often see associated with suicidal ideation and behavior, regardless of age group, but with children and adolescents, it tends to be a little bit more noticeable because, of course, children and adolescents live a life that has more eyes on it than an independent adult may. When we move on to fact number 3 and how children and adolescents express their suicidality differently, one of the key components that comes into play here is what we refer to as a mature concept of death. So, as a general rule, kids who grow up in healthy, typical, normal environments, depending on sort of their own maturity and their own cognitive makeup and those sorts of things, anywhere between 7 to 9 years of age will develop what we would refer to as a mature concept of death, and that they understand what death means, and they understand that suicide means their own, the own permanent end to their own life. Adults, as a general rule, who are contemplating suicide, understand that death is the result, and death is permanent and final in all facets. With children and adolescents, what you'll see, and particularly among children, is that with the absence of a mature, complete concept of death, what they see suicide is the end to the stuff in their life that is bad, but that they don't necessarily understand that that the stuff that their life that is good similarly goes away. So the kid in your school who is being bullied and is thinking about suicide, they think that suicide will put an end to the bullying, but they may not necessarily understand that that also means they don't go to their friend's birthday party next week, and that they don't get to sing in the Christmas concert coming up in 2 months. Children are by nature egocentric. They see the world as only what they can sort of see at the end of their nose. And one of the things we love and hate about adolescence at the same time is that life is all about them as well. But when it comes to suicide, some of this stuff really comes into play where they are very selective about what they're going to be walking away from if they engage in suicide. The other issue that comes into play as well is that kids may have developed a relatively mature concept of death, but in times of trauma, it's going to disappear on them. So the best parallel I can draw for you is the student that you're working with in your classroom to not hit when somebody takes something away from them. You do all the role playing, you do all the practicing, and they tell you they're going to use their words and they're not going to hit anymore, and then a student takes away their pencil, and the first thing they do is punch them in the face. It's because of that trauma and that stress that they're encountering that they can't necessarily remember all of the concrete and the things that they understand, and they operate from a place from emotion. And this is where they will move back to a place of suicide as an option to get away from the stuff I don't like, but the stuff that I do like will still be there. As we look at suicide as it pertains to children, we generally know that the rates are lower among children than they do adolescents, and quite noticeably lower, although there certainly is evidence of suicide in children under the age of 10. But this is really where the notion of ideation, the seed is planted for them, and it's not typical that we would envision that children are thinking about suicide. So they may be less apt to get support or have assistance dealing with that ideation, and we know it doesn't go away, and so it will come across again in adolescence, and that's where we see that notion of they're 6 times more likely to attempt in adolescence, because we can very likely assume that they've not received support as children, because we don't often associate suicidal ideation and behavior with children under the age of 10. When we get into adolescence again, they may have had experiences where they've thought about it more than just the time that we know of in front of us. Their concept of death is a little bit smoky for us. We don't necessarily understand exactly what they know. And then, of course, part of adolescence is low impulse control and that sense of invincibility. And so what we may see is an engagement in higher risk behaviors for those young people, or we may see adolescents who are we're running around with an older group, or all of a sudden drawn to more of a, and I'm doing the air quotes here, a street culture, or some behaviors that are not typical for them because of that inability to sort of manage that emotional control and that sense of safety and that sort of thing around them as well. Moving on to fact number 4, this slide draws a really nice compare and contrast for you around self-injury and self-harm. Historically, self-harming behaviors have been lumped in with self-harm and self-injury behaviors have been lumped in with suicidal behaviors. And what we know is that they are very, very different animals. The challenge for us, specifically when we're working with children and adolescents, is the behaviors can look very, very similar. So the most common self-harming behavior that we know of when we're looking at adolescents is going to be cutting. And when we look at suicidal ideation and behavior, it's not uncommon that we may see cutting behaviors from young people as well, because their access to means of suicide is more limited than it would be for an adult. So if you're looking at 2 young people both cutting, it is very possible that one is doing it expressly with the intent of self-harm with absolutely no intent to die, and the person beside them is engaging in behavior with an expressed interest to die, and it's not about self-harm. The challenge for us is making sure that we understand what the intent of the behavior is, and the only way we do that is by talking to the young person. But then our response is going to be will be a marked difference. If somebody is dealing with self-harming behaviors, we cannot intervene from a suicide perspective. The parallel I would draw would be like bringing in a math tutor for a kid who struggles with English. If a young person is engaging in self-harming behaviors with no intent to die, we need to provide them self-harm specific supports. If a young person is engaging in suicidal behaviors, then we want to make sure that we're providing suicide supports, which can and will include an intervention and a risk assessment by somebody who has the clinical or medical background to do that. This slide here that you're looking at does a nice job of indicating the differences in the purpose, duration, frequency, methods, motivations, and frequency between self-harming and suicidal ideation. And what you will see is that self-harming behaviors occur at a far greater frequency than suicidal behaviors will in young people. Sort of as a general rule, we know that self-harming behaviors can occur as frequently as 100 times for every incidence of completed suicide. So we know that young people are engaging in this behavior far greater frequency, and as educators, you're probably far more likely to see this behavior. But again, we know that young people are also engaging in suicidal behavior. And we are, down the road, a future webinar will be more focused specifically on self-harm. It's very difficult to cover this all in just a few minutes. But the most important facet of this is to make sure that we're taking the time to understand what the intent of the behavior that you're seeing. While we understand that a young person engaging in self-harming behavior with no intent to die, there is that risk that ultimately they could die from that behavior. We know that the young person may not necessarily understand that, but you need to be sure to respond appropriately. And finally, one of the greatest myths that's existed in the field of suicide is this notion of if we talk to young people about suicide, we're going to give them ideas, we're going to add a coping mechanism to their list that they've not thought about before. There's reams of evidence and research that tells us this is actually not the case, and in fact, we provide a far greater sense of safety by talking to young people about suicide than we do by not talking to them at all. If we do not talk to young people about suicide, it sort of keeps that myth, that stereotype going that suicide is a dirty little secret. Suicide is something that shouldn't be talked about. Many of us grew up with maybe parents from the generation where suicide was not something that was talked about. But we know that young people today need to have that ability to filter out the parts that they're hearing already with good information. Children and adolescents are learning about death and are learning about suicide on the schoolyard, on the school bus, at the bus stop, at the mall, over social media, talking to their friends, and without the ability to talk to adults who can filter out what's accurate and inaccurate, what's safe and what's unsafe, then we know that young people will simply frame an opinion based on what their friends have told them, or what they've learned about in social media. So they need to have the ability to have meaningful conversations with adults who are willing to talk to them, willing to listen to their story, and understand the role that suicide plays for them, and answer questions for them, because the risk is left on their own. They make up their own mind and come up with their own decisions, and information about suicide and self-harm, you know, a bunch of 14-year-olds will not be able to come to the safest conclusion about what suicide means for a young person and where to go with that. So it's very important that we have open dialogue, and most importantly, that young people know that they can come to adults and talk to them. Part of the fear for adolescents is this notion of, if I talk to an adult about it, will I scare them? Will they run away? Will they leave me? And it's important that we provide them with a forum to have that discussion, to talk about the feelings that are going on that have brought them to where they're at today. And hopefully this webinar has given you some tools to be able to do that and to respond to those invitations to discussion that young people give you when they reach out to you, whether through the "my friend was thinking about suicide, what should I tell them," when you know it might be actually them, or simply those natural opportunities that come up for discussion. And hopefully this webinar has been able to provide you some support and assistance to that. So with that, I think I will wrap up the my portion of this. I see that there's been some questions coming up, and certainly happy to answer any of those questions that Patty wants to bring forward, and we'll take it from there. Patty?
Thank you, Kevin. We've had a couple of questions. One of the questions that has come up is with regards to a copy of the self-harm suicidal attempt comparison, and then just a question about whether they can get a copy of all the slides. Now, we are going to send out a recording which will provide this context, the slide and the recorded audio, Kevin. I'm just wondering whether you guys might want to post the slides on the Center for Suicide Prevention website as well.
Yep. The slides will be posted on the Center for Suicide Prevention website. That's www.suicideinfo.ca. So all of these slides will be posted on there, and again, self-harm will be one of the future topics for a webinar. I know that sort of seeing the questions and comments here, that's one of the areas that has garnered some interest. Self-harm will be a specific webinar that we'll be looking at for young people and providing. In addition, we're working on webinars specific to substance use and abuse and their impact on suicide in young people, suicide considerations specific to the GLBT community, the role of cyberbullying, a webinar specific to suicide in children under the age of 12, and finally contagions, clusters, and social media, and the role that social media can play in those contagions and clusters, because we know that back in the day it used to be sort of suicide clusters that occurred within schools, and now the role of social media, of course, can bring people together that are not specific, say, to just schools or geographic neighborhoods. So we'll be providing information in a webinar format specific to that as well.
Super, because I see somebody's asking about commenting on a suicide contagion study. I'm not sure whether you... Oh, contagion and suicide clusters, and there's a link here.
Yes. You know, and I think those clusters have long been a behavior that's associated with adolescence. I mean, I think back to when I was a young adult. I can remember reading in the paper here about suicide pacts that were occurring in a small center just outside of Calgary, and of course, those were a bunch of kids that were in school together, and sort of it took on a life of its own, for lack of a better term. And unfortunately, what we know about suicide pacts is that historically they've operated in great silence, or sort of, kids on their own talking about it in the schoolyard. But the other part of it is that most of the young people that are engaged in those pacts are not necessarily committed to engaging in the behavior. But of course, what it does is it puts the most vulnerable in that pact at risk as well. The difference with social media, of course, is that it's brought vulnerable, broken souls together who don't need to go to school together. They can literally connect all over the world. And then, of course, there are terrible people out there who go looking for these kinds of people online and try to encourage them to engage in the behavior and promote it and that sort of thing. So I think the role of those contagions and pacts have dramatically changed, and that's the impact of social media has been significant on that, in that it can bring together the most vulnerable of people, regardless of age group. It can bring them together in a way that just isolates them more from everybody else, because they can sit at home at their computer in the dark by themselves and find other like souls. And so it's dramatically changed sort of the dynamic of that, and certainly we will look to provide more information about that when we look at the role of social media both in terms of cyberbullying and its role in suicide, but the role of social media itself in suicide as well.
Great, thanks, Kevin. And we have a question too about whether you would inform parents if you were a teacher having some of the conversations that you've alluded to in the presentation today.
Well, one thing we know is that from a legal perspective, we have an obligation. If we are having a conversation with a specific student that we think is at risk of suicide, we have a legal as well as a moral obligation to engage the guardian. If we're talking specifically about open conversations in classrooms or with groups of young people, whether that's in a class or in a sort of a cluster of youth in a youth group or something like that, I think there's an element that depends on where you work. I mean, I certainly know that I've gone and spoken in high schools to assemblies of 600 kids. Whether each of those 600 kids' families were directly informed in advance that was going to be a subject of discussion in high school, I don't know, or if that was sort of embedded in, sort of the forms that are filled out from a consent perspective at the start of the year. Certainly I know that, teachers have reached out to the Center for supports and resources that they can embed into their classes for discussion, and they've done it in some creative ways as well, where it's not just a presenter like myself coming in and talking to a group of students in a classroom, but we've done things like participated in novel studies with high school groups around a novel called 13 Reasons Why, which is a young adult novel that looks specifically at the issue of suicide. And so, whether the parents were engaged in that process before or not, I can't specifically refer to it in that section. But if you are working individually with one young person, you're having a conversation where you think they are specifically at risk of suicide, you do have an obligation to engage the guardian, or worst case scenario, children's services or the police, if you think engaging the family will actually put the young person at greater risk. And certainly knowing within your own school setting and your school board what the protocol and procedures are for doing that, whether it's got to funnel through the principal or through yourself directly, it would be worthwhile going back and asking that question of your administration, I think.
Great, thanks, Kevin. And Andrea from Manitoba, I believe, has pointed out that another excellent resource that covers some of the material in a bit more depth that you talked about today is Straight Talk, and that's available through the Center for Suicide Prevention as well.
Yeah, we have the Straight Talk, which is aimed specifically at the youth population, age 12 to really into early 20s, depending on different different bodies and different levels of government. They all define youth differently, but this is really sort of the workshop aimed specifically at those working with youth, and it's a little more than a half-day workshop. And then there's also a workshop called Tattered Teddies, which is a half-day workshop specifically aimed to people working with children between the ages of 5 and 12, and concerns about suicide related to that. And so certainly those workshops are geared specifically towards the child and adolescent population and provide certainly much more expanded information that we've been able to cover here in the 20 minutes, as well as a little bit more practical and intervention focused stuff as well. And you can and as well through our website, there's some print resources that would be available that may be of support to the people that are participating in this webinar too, and would have access to. And so I would again encourage people to take a look at at our website as well, the suicideinfo.ca website as well.
Great. Do we have any more questions for Kevin? Okay, Andrea's pointing out that Straight Talk is a full-day workshop and Tattered Teddies is a half-day workshop. All right, so I'm thinking we look like we're just getting lots of great thanks. So at this point, thank you, Kevin, and your colleagues, Linda, Dave, Robert, and the others at the Center for Suicide Prevention for pulling together a great presentation. If people have further questions after the end of the webinar today, there's the email address on the screen right now. You can direct those questions to the Center for Suicide Prevention. We will be forwarding the link for the recording and a survey in the next few days. We'd really appreciate you filling out those surveys so that we get some ideas and feedback about how the process went today, and certainly interest in other topics. Based on the success and interest for this webinar, we will be in discussions and looking at planning how we enable the development of those additional webinars that Kevin's already alluded to. And when we have more information, we'll be sharing that with everybody. So thank you very much and have a great evening.